Up next for our HPC Impact presentation is Dr. Gareth Davies, hydrodynamic modeler at Geoscience Australia, with his talk, Tsunamis in Australia, HPC for Hazard Assessment. Dr. Gareth Davies has worked for Geoscience Australia since 2010 on a range of natural hazard projects, particularly related to the computational and statistical modeling of tsunamis, floods, and coastal storm waves. This includes leading development of the 2018 Australian Probabilistic Tsunami Hazard Assessment. Dr. Davies contributes to the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group, the Science Working Group of the Joint Australian Tsunami Warning Centre, and the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System. He previously did a PhD in coastal geomorphology at Wollongong University and studied mathematics and geography at Melbourne University. Today's presentation will discuss computational approaches to understanding Australia's tsunami hazard using HPC, focusing on tsunamis generated by distant earthquakes. Dr. Davies, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. So basically what I'm going to talk about today is I'll start out and give a bit of an introduction to tsunamis and the kind of computations that we do to study tsunamis. And then a bit of an overview of Australia's tsunami hazard and the kind of challenges that arise for understanding what that is, okay, so for tsunami hazard assessment. Then I'll go into a bit of detail about the science underlying the 2018 Australian Probabilistic Tsunami Hazard Assessment and touch on some of our current and future research in this area. Okay, so Tsunami 101. This image here is showing plots of the locations of historic events that generated tsunamis. So most of these orange dots are earthquakes, and we also see a couple of other events that generate tsunamis, often landslides or volcanoes, various other things. So what you can see here is that these lines are tectonic plate boundaries, okay? And the tsunami source generation is really concentrated along particular tectonic plate boundaries. The ones where it's concentrated on are actually where the plates are converging. So one plate is kind of sinking under another, and they're building up stress. So the way that this works is basically at these subduction zones. So we've got one plate, generally called the oceanic plate, that is going underneath another plate, and that builds up stress over time in the subduction zone. And so we get a lot of earthquakes in these areas, and when a big earthquake happens, we basically have some of the stress being released through slip on this fault. Now, the important thing about earthquakes is that they don't just lead to motion on the fault, but they actually kind of deform the whole area around. So they actually lift the earth up and down in the region as well. And if that happens under the ocean, then you lift up the ocean or subside the ocean, and that creates a gravitational disturbance, which is what makes the tsunami. So in practice, earthquakes, they might have sort of variable slips. So here, this is a representation of a fault with colors on different patches representing a hypothetical earthquake scenario. And that sort of slip might lead to elastic deformation in the region that looks like this, so uplift and subsidence. And so basically, if we take that and put that into a hydrodynamic model as an initial condition, then we get something like this. So this is a simulation of a tsunami hazard scenario, actually from our hazard assessment that I'll talk about later. And I picked this out because it's very similar to the 2011 Japan tsunami, okay, so the Tohoku tsunami that probably most people would know. So here I'm just modeling this with the linear shallow water equations, which is a very simple model, but one that works well in the deep ocean. And you can see that the tsunami, it's not just one wave, but we actually end up with a whole series of waves occurring due to all the reflections. And this can last for, a day or a couple of days, depending on where you are. So this is a simple model, but it works quite well for these large earthquake tsunamis in the deep ocean. here we've got a comparison of this modelled scenario in red with observed time series of the tsunami wave height in the deep ocean all around the Pacific Ocean. So these are sort of dedicated sensors that we have nowadays to measure tsunamis. And so by the standards of the field I work in, these show pretty good agreement, in particular given the scenario wasn't heavily tuned to reproduce the results. It's just one we picked from our database that was similar. So yeah, this model works quite well for simulating tsunamis, at least for in the deep ocean for the first few hours. Now, the issue with tsunamis is that in the deep ocean, they're actually often fairly small waves, you know, maybe far from the source, tens of centimeters, and they're often quite long and might be hard to notice if you're out in the deep ocean. The problem is that as these waves approach shore, because they're shallow water waves, they cause the whole water column to move, and when you approach the shoreline, you sort of squeeze the wave into smaller depths, and as a result of energy conservation, then the wave heights tend to increase, and so they can become quite hazardous at the coast. So this is basically because of wave shoaling, right? But in practice, what happens is that there's very complex interactions of these waves with the nearshore topography. So you can see that in the animation here, and then also over on the bottom right, this is a field example. So these are a couple of observed tsunami waveforms in Australia during the Chile 1960 tsunami. So these are two sites near Sydney that are, you know, reasonably close together but in neighbouring estuaries. And so you can see you've got the tide here, but also the tsunami over the top, which is really showing different behaviour in these two places. So you get very local variations in amplification, or depending on where you are. Okay, so why we use HPC for our kind of work? So we're not huge users of HPC. We're sort of the intermediate users, and, you know, a lot of important science is done by people who are using to an intermediate level. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the kind of problems that we might work on. So one thing we often need to do, and perhaps the cheapest sort of model we might often want to run, would just to be simulating at a global scale the shallow water equations, which we often do on about a 1 arc-minute resolution grid. And so for us to do this individually, it's reasonably cheap. If you ran it on even one core, it would take roughly as long as real time. You know, so if you simulate for 30 hours, maybe it takes about 30 hours, give or take, maybe a little less. But in our work, we tend to do large numbers of these things. So a study I'll show later, we did about 4,000 simulations. So for this, we need some HPC resources. It's not necessarily huge, but, you know, you're talking a few 100,000 CPU hours, that kind of thing. Once we start modelling inundation and say linking those models in with nested nearshore models, the compute gets a bit heavier because we need to have high resolution areas, and so basically that means our models have a lot more cells, and also the kind of algorithms we use, they have to take smaller time steps and use also more robust numerical methods, or different kinds of numerical methods that are a bit more expensive. And so, yeah, the cost goes up. So here's a model I've been running lately, which has high resolution areas in various parts of Australia where we have tide gauge data. And so say to evolve 60 hours of this on the Gardi supercomputer at MPI, it takes about 1.5 KSU. So again, that's not a huge problem, but our costs, the computation we need to do tends to grow because we often want to run a lot of scenarios. So for a recent study I've been doing, I ran 70, but in future we're really going to be wanting to run many, many more to better understand the variability of our hazard models, and also look at larger models. So this is the sort of scale we're looking at. For these kinds of models, once you do the nesting, there's sort of interesting things that come up with parallel decomposition. So we have to partition all these domains into pieces so we can spread them over MPI ranks. And the domains, they have different methods, they can take different time steps. And so if you just naively spread those over your ranks, it's quite easy to introduce a lot of load imbalance, and make things run inefficiently. But so what we do is actually tend to start out and run a really short simulation and then figure out what would be a better way to distribute the work among all our processes. And then we can get things to run reasonably efficiently after that. So load balancing is quite important for these problems with nested grids. Okay, so I guess the key point is here that the kind of things we're doing, the main point where it gets heavy is if we're wanting to run large numbers of scenarios, which we often do. Just going to give a bit of background now to Australia's tsunami hazard. So we're quite well located, favourably located for tsunamis because we're far from most of the sources. And so tsunami impacts, in general, they tend to be worse close to the source. So this is an image from the Tohoku tsunami in Japan in 2011 that I'm sure we're all familiar with. And if you look at Australian history, there is an interesting history of tsunamis. There's been some hazardous events that have occurred, but to my knowledge, no one has died, and it's reasonably rare that these things happen. I'm sure that many Australians wouldn't even realise there is a tsunami hazard in Australia, and that's because it's not very prominent. But so, is it something that we need to worry about? Well, our location really is very favourable, but the problem and the things that we need to consider are that large earthquake tsunamis can actually be deadly even very far from the source. So the Chile 1960 event, it famously was generated in Chile in South America, travelled right across the Pacific Ocean and killed 142 people in Japan. It also made thousands of people homeless, the inundation there. So they can be very dangerous even a long way from the source due to the directionality. The same event killed 61 people in Hawaii, and this is about 11,000 kilometres away, 10 metres of run-up. There are other examples of like this. One of them is Sumatra 2004, where it killed 250,000 people near the source, but even as far away as 5,000 kilometres away, killed 300 people in Somalia. So for Australia, the main concern, I guess, is having, if we have one of these large events that's well placed to send waves to our shoreline, maybe we could see bigger waves than what we've seen in the past. And historically, you can see that the events that have happened, they haven't been particularly well suited to send large waves to Australia. However, some of the smaller events that have happened actually were hazardous. So on the left here, we have the Java 2006 tsunami, which was generated by a relatively small earthquake, but actually is notorious for producing the largest measured tsunami run-up ever in Australia. So it was 7.9 metres of run-up at a site in Western Australia. This event mostly affected a fairly remote area, but there were people camping on the beach and their campsites were trashed. They fled inland as the wave inundated. And I think this event, the fact that this is the biggest locally that we've seen, it really highlights the importance of tsunami directivity. These fingering patterns of the wave. You don't want to be in an unfortunate location. On the right, we see the Chile 1960 tsunami, so it's a much bigger event, not well suited to affect Australia, but still actually hazardous on much of the east coast. So there were a couple of boat sinkings, hundreds of broken moorings, some areas with significant erosion and people got into trouble in the area, a couple of rescues resulting from that. So it's not the kind of thing that's a big hazard, but it's certainly something that you'd want to warn people about. The main concern for us, I guess, is that hypothetically, these kind of big earthquake events, well, they could occur in other locations which could be better suited to directing large waves to Australia. So here on the left, I've got a hypothetical scenario in the eastern Sunda Arc, okay, so, and on the right, on the Kermadec-Tonga Trench. So there's significant uncertainty about whether these kind of events could occur or how often they would occur, basically because that just reflects the current state of subduction earthquake science in most places. These are large subduction zones where the plates are converging rapidly and where we've seen other significant earthquakes. We don't really have a strong reason for thinking that they couldn't host large earthquakes, but the problem is earthquakes, such big events, are sufficiently rare that the science of saying when and where they can't happen is just not that well developed. Okay, so there's invariably pretty significant uncertainties in understanding the likelihoods of these kind of events. But of course, we want to think about this. So if these events did happen, what would happen and how likely do we think it is that they might? So this is what tsunami hazard assessment is about. So tsunami hazard assessment is kind of diverse, but basically most studies will boil down to modelling the coastal tsunami behaviour for a whole suite of hypothetical earthquakes. So that you want to think about which areas might be inundated or have marine impacts and how likely that might be to happen. Now, it turns out that this is not straightforward, and the particular challenge for tsunami hazard assessment is that generally there's very high uncertainty in how we should represent earthquakes and their occurrence. And coupled with that, there's not sort of standardization of methodologies in terms of how we do that. So we end up seeing great variation of methods and results among tsunami modelling studies. Just to give you an example of that, my colleague Diana Greenslade from the Bureau of Meteorology worked with a whole bunch of modelling groups, and they did this exercise where they said, let's all generate a hypothetical earthquake with a given location and a given magnitude, and then the groups could make up the earthquake however they thought was appropriate. And then show me what the tsunami would be like at a certain specified point, okay? So they're all giving the same magnitude and location and the same point for the tsunami. And as you can see, they're quite different, okay? So sort of highlights that there are these uncertainties in how we should represent earthquakes for the purpose of tsunami simulation. And seeing things like this, it really made me think, okay, we better do some serious testing of our approaches. Something else, another example of this sort of variation in results is this study in 2013 in Australia did an onshore hazard assessment and looked at the effects of using two different offshore recurrence models, basically, that have been put together by two different groups. And they found sort of variations in the wave heights of a factor of between 2 and 5 or so. And this is not unique to Australia. We still see this persisting. People are writing papers about this in the South China Sea and so on at the moment. It's hard to get consistency. All right, so what are we doing at GA in this area? So one of our main contributions has been the 2018 Australian Probabilistic Tsunami Hazard Assessment. So basically, this is a large database of offshore earthquake tsunami scenarios. And the reason we produce this is that, as we've seen, so these onshore tsunami hazard assessments, they basically are combining inundation models with offshore scenarios. And because of this lack of standardization in how the offshore scenarios are done, we see this great variation in methods and results. So one way to move towards dealing with that is having a nationally consistent set of scenarios which have been all developed with the same methodology and subject to significant testing. Okay, so at the very least, that kind of provides a reference point. So no matter where you are, you can say, well, what does this study say? And we have some idea of how we can expect its methods to perform and some capacity to compare with elsewhere. So even if our results may not be perfectly right everywhere, and I'm sure that we'll revise these things over time, that degree of consistency is useful for comparing things. And also, we're able to do a lot more testing than many groups because we can sort of focus at this scale. So what we do is we model tsunamis generated by earthquakes on a whole bunch of source zones. And basically, so these here are like faults, basically, where the earthquakes can happen. And here they are split up into these little boxes. So basically, we discretize them into little pieces that we call unit sources. And we represent all our earthquake events in the database as linear combinations of these unit sources. So this is a spatially variable slip in this example here with a given slip on each unit source. So now there's all this uncertainty I just suggested in how we should represent earthquakes for the purpose of tsunami generation. And so as part of this study, we actually tested 3 different approaches. So the first one on the left is what people traditionally do in this area and what we've often done, which is just having a constant slip over the fault plane and having a rupture size that is sort of deterministically related to the earthquake magnitude. The one in the middle is like that, but tries to account for natural variability in the earthquake area. So it turns out from observation, some earthquakes are kind of quite compact and some are more spread out. And this has quite an effect on their tsunamis. So this model is trying to represent that using some empirical results. On the right, we have a similar model, but that uses spatially variable slip. Okay, so what we do then is to simulate the tsunamis from all of these hypothetical earthquakes, we actually just model the tsunami from each of the unit sources and then exploit the linearity of the problem to derive all the other solutions by summation. Okay, and so this lets us, it's a really great technique for the deep ocean side of things. It's mathematically exact, and it makes it feasible to simulate kind of a million scenarios, which would be a very difficult problem otherwise. And it also feasible to distribute that online. So I think our database is about 4 terabytes in size versus, maybe 1,000 times larger that you would need to simulate the scenarios directly. So it's very important for us to have access to the NCI thread server to distribute this to people. So basically we use a mixture of that and then a tutorial and scripts on GitHub to help end users extract just the parts of scenarios that they need. All right, so now I said that, how we do this is uncertain, and so we better start testing. So we did quite a bit of testing. We basically looked at these deep ocean observations that I showed earlier, and in the period where they were available, we had 18 different observed tsunamis. So in that period, we thought, okay, we'll test the model with these 18 events. And so a simple thing that we can ask is that, well, do some of our hypothetical earthquake models produce tsunamis like the observations? And then a more complex question is to study the distribution of these random tsunami scenarios and compare them with observations and try and make statements about the stochastic biases, if you like, in the models. So we approach both these questions. The simplest thing is just to look for scenarios that seem similar to the observed data. And basically by doing that, what we found is that our model that didn't account for variations in the earthquake size, so the simplest model we tested, there were some important historical events that it just couldn't represent the waves well from. So we found limitations in that model straight away. The other 2 models that had variable size, they both worked similarly well and they performed better in general. So doing this over many events, we kind of found this consistent pattern where sometimes the model that neglected size variations didn't work well, other times it did. And the other 2 models, they were reasonably consistent. Okay, we also did some statistical work looking at actually the distribution of these random scenarios and how biases might creep in. So, for example, we wouldn't want a model that 90% of the time generated tsunamis that were too small compared with observations, or too big. We want the variability to be about right, and you can study that by looking at the distribution of observed events versus the predicted spread. And so, based on that, we found that our heterogeneous slip model seemed to be performing better. So, yeah, from the testing, we were able to sort of make recommendations about which kind of scenarios people should be using in the hazard assessments to take the inundation on shore. Okay, so now on the one hand we need these scenarios, on the other hand we need to think about how often they might occur. So essentially our methodology for doing this works by combining historical earthquake observations on the one hand with tectonic plate movement information on the other. So basically the historical earthquake information gives you some statistical basis for extrapolating out for the smaller events. But as with many extreme value kind of problems, it offers you limited information about the more extreme events of interest. The plate tectonic information, though, gives you some constraints on how often really big earthquakes occur, basically because the tectonics is controlling this rate of stress buildup, okay? And so if we bring that information in, then we get some constraints at the higher end, although still often very uncertain. And so essentially we stick these things together and use Bayesian techniques to quantify the uncertainties. And then we sort of spread the modelled earthquake frequencies over the source zones so that in areas where the plates are converging faster, we're more likely to have earthquakes, which is what we expect. So to test this kind of thing, we looked at comparing our globally integrated model predictions with global scale observations. That gives you a bit more power to detect biases in the higher events just because you have more data at that aggregated scale. And it seems to perform okay. We also had a bunch of site-specific places where there's longer-term data available, so maybe from geological studies and this sort of thing. And at those sites, we're able to do site-specific testing. And so based on this, we think that our model is performing reasonably, noting that these things do have very large uncertainties associated with them. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on some current work we're doing. So I'd really like to extend this offshore testing with nearshore testing, so testing at tide gauges with nearshore observations. So that's a really useful thing because on the one hand, obviously, we're particularly interested in how tsunamis behave in the nearshore for applications, but also there's much more data available. You know, the deep ocean measurements, that's fairly high tech and it only really became good in around, you know, the mid-2000s or so. Whereas we have tsunami observations for a much longer period in the nearshore areas all around the world, including Australia. So we've basically looked at sites where we have decent tsunami observations in Australia and decent data, and set up these high resolution models like I showed you at the start. And so then we kind of want to repeat the logic that we used for the deep ocean data and say, okay, do we produce random tsunamis that look like observations, and do we have statistical biases? So yeah, this is proceeding at the moment, and so at the end of that we want to have an understanding of the performance of these random hazard scenarios. Modelling nearshore is a bit more difficult though, it's more expensive, there's non-linearities and so on. And so in order to screen out any issues that arise, the first thing we're doing is actually focusing on simulating published source models and scenarios from our analysis that work well versus data. And so basically they'll be less variable. And so, you know, if you, in a sense, that makes it easier to notice problems that might be unrelated to our source model. So that's the first check we're doing. Yeah, so we've been modelling a whole bunch of sources. We have a paper submitted about this work at the moment. And this is the kind of thing we get. So these are observations and models of the Sumatra 2004 tsunami in Perth. And you can see I've got 3 gauge sites there and the observations in black and one particular model in red. And you can kind of see that we more or less track the general properties of the nearshore wave time series, but we don't get the details exactly right, and that's totally common. What we'd be quite happy with is if more or less the statistical properties of these extrema are behaving themselves. That's probably kind of what we need for doing hazard assessment. And you can see, you know, we correctly get the heavy attenuation in this area, for example, and so on. So yeah, we're doing these kind of things, also looking at some PTHA scenarios, and that's looking promising. The work is ongoing. Okay, so the conclusions are, I guess, that, well, history shows that Australia does have a tsunami hazard. And, you know, large earthquakes in future that might happen in an unfortunate location that maybe could be more dangerous than things we've observed historically. The likelihood of this happening is quite uncertain, and that's just a general problem for tsunami hazard assessment, basically stemming from the rarity of large earthquakes. But I think that the methodologies that we use can be improved by doing this kind of multi-event testing. Okay, so treating the models like, the stochastic models, and seeing if the variability that we see in nature is kind of consistent with our models. And the NCI, Guardi, previously Reagent, and also the Thread server, they're fundamental to enabling us to do this kind of work. So thanks very much.